Thank you, Eric. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. And it's Friday, and the sun has come out, and it's spring. Yay! So we give thanks. So today we're going to talk about elderhood and what this is and how we might access this, what this means for us, and not just for people who are older than us, but actually for us, because this is all about us. And as Eric said, today, as we move through this a couple of hours, if you have questions, please ask them as they come to you. Let's be informal. Let's let this be a dialogue and not a lecture. And we're going to do a couple of interactive things today during this morning session too. One of the handouts you have on your table already, and another will be coming out later. So if it's all right with you, we'll get started. So here are our learning objectives today, and I should say the slide deck will come out to you. I'm sorry you don't have it in front of you if you're a person who likes to take notes. But this is what we're going to cover. We're going to look at elderhood and particularly try and understand this in terms of how has retirement supplanted elderhood as a life stage. We're going to talk about what is elderhood and how is this different from adulthood. We're going to spend a little bit of time today working together, trying to reframe and reimagine what elderhood could be like for us. And then, of course, we're going to look at how a deeper and better understanding of elderhood and its differences from adulthood can help us in behavioral health practice. How can this help us to be more ethical in our practice? How can this make our practice more meaningful? So let's start with what is age and what are these life stages and how do we define these? And the first thing I want to say is that age is a social construct. It's something that we've created socially, right? It's in a social framework. And so if we go way, way back in time, back before we can even really say how it was, then, and we don't really know, this is a guess, but we would have had infants and children would have come into maturity as adults, and this probably would have happened over a fairly short time period because we know that people didn't live as long for all kinds of reasons. So probably the average lifespan was maybe in the 20s or the 30s. Some of the hypotheses that we have about what life might have been way back in the midst of time would be that people who had more experience, i.e. people who had lived longer, would be very good sources of knowledge. They would know where good water sources were. They would know where food sources were. I think even pre-agriculture, when we were hunting and gathering, right? People with experience would have been valuable for survival, because we're all about survival. So being older would have conferred a benefit in terms of more experience. There's also a biological hypothesis called the grandmother hypothesis. And this has been put forward. Nobody really knows, but the idea here is that this is trying to understand why women go through menopause. And the idea is, in this theory of the grandmother hypothesis, that postmenopausal women don't have to give their energy to birthing children so they can support other women who are. So it introduces this idea of this intergenerational kin network of support, right? And we don't know. These are just hypotheses. If we think about the social and cultural construction of age in the West and pre-industrial revolution, so we're talking pre-1800s, right? Then we see that we had infancy, babies are born, they become children, and then there's this abrupt transition into adulthood, right? That young children have to take on adult-like tasks pretty quickly. There isn't an extended childhood unless somebody is very wealthy. Again, most adults are not living into old age. Lifespan is maybe 40s. Actually, the increase in our longevity is a very, very recent phenomenon. So we also see some connections between being older and being considered wise, although I think it's fair to say that there is no evidence that older adults have been universally revered in any culture. Ageism has definitely been shown to be a pan-cultural phenomenon. But you can think about things like, we think about colonial Williamsburg, right? And we see sometimes the men wearing white wigs, and sometimes, we watch movies about the 18th century and the women are wearing powdered white wigs. And why is this? Why would that have been fashionable? It was considered fashionable because there was an understanding that gray hair connoted wisdom. But there was not a universal reverence for older people. Thinking in more modern terms, thinking now maybe about the 19th century, so post-industrial revolution in the West. Again, you have infancy and childhood, and you have the introduction of this life stage now called adolescence, from the Latin word adolescere, which is to mature or to grow into. And this term actually appears as early as the 15th century. It actually goes back that far. But this graph shows you, this is a search of Google books from 1860 to the year 2000, searching for the term adolescence. And you see it appears in books from the 1860s, but you see a steep increase in the interest in this life phase. And so when we think about age being a cultural construction, why is this phase of adolescence now introduced when it didn't seem to be there earlier on? One of the reasons put forth for this is that as society grows wealthier, people can afford to have this more extended, protected period before they get jettisoned from childhood into adulthood, right? So we now have this longer transitional phase that people who are reasonably well off can afford to do. Still, you're seeing in the 19th century plenty of working class children and poor children getting catapulted right into adulthood, right into work. But for others, for wealthier ones, this transitional stage. We also have, in the 19th century, for the first time, things like birth rates, death rates, and employment rates are being collected and calculated. So we now have the emergence of this data set of information from the 19th century about how long people live and what the population looks like. And it is around this time that we have this coalescing emergence of this understanding of old age, right? And old age being characterized very much as a period of decline in terms of the 3 Ds, disease, decline, and death. That to be old is, first of all, to be incapable of work. And if we're looking at this period before the introduction of things like Social Security, if you were not wealthy and you did not work, you didn't eat, you didn't survive. And so you see this growing horror of old age as this stage where many people become physically incapable of working, fall into poverty, are sick, and are therefore objects of pity. And you also see in the 19th century the emergence of almshouses and poor farms, which is where people went when they were very poor and often when they were old as well. And these places were places of horror, places that people didn't want to go. And I've put up here a quote from Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher who's now passed on. But he is a really interesting man in terms of his writings and his teachings. And he talks about the emergence of population as a tool of power. And any of you who've heard VCU Gerontology's presentation on ageism might hear some echoes in that. Even today, we talk about the crisis of the aging population, as if this is some tremendous disaster that's befalling us. When we would say to you at VCU Gerontology, there's no disaster. There's no crisis in terms of having a growing older population. That seems like a huge opportunity. If there's a crisis, the crisis is more likely located in the lack of infrastructure to support a growing older population. But there's no crisis because people are growing older. And then we see, getting into more modern times, we see in the 20th century the development and the conceptualization of our older age as a phase of retirement, that retirement actually becomes a life stage. And so we go from childhood into our adolescence and have this transitional period. We emerge into adulthood, which is the desired and desirable state. And then, if we're lucky and we can afford to, we retire at 65 or whatever. What's really interesting is that this was made possible by the introduction of things like Social Security. Previous to that, you didn't have that income to live on. You had to keep working. And we have that introduced in the 30s. We have Medicare and Medicaid introduced in the 60s. But what's very interesting about retirement and the creation of this social and political and economic structures that support retirement is that they were motivated by beliefs about workplace productivity, that older adults were not as productive in the workplace, that they couldn't keep up, and that there was a need societally to kind of sweep this older generation out of the workforce and preserve jobs for younger people. And there's been a lot of historical work done on this, and we don't conceive it in this way necessarily, but certainly the research on this shows that these were the motivations. And retirement has also been glamorized as an aspect of consumerism, that retirement is something that we consume, that the societal messaging to us is, these will be our golden years, we're gonna, go off and we'll play, right? We've worked hard, now we'll play. And if you look at advertisements for senior living, that's a great example right there. Because what do they show you pictures of? Very, very beautiful old people holding hands and walking on the beach, or playing on the golf course or whatever, right? It's this like golden, amazing time. And so it's been glamorized as something we should consume. Meanwhile, older adults have been positioned by this cultural story we tell ourselves about retirement as people who take. They are there to consume. They are not productive. That when we grow older, our duty is to kind of migrate off to the edges of society, right? And there was a belief, there was a theory that came out in the 60s about aging called the disengagement theory, which put forth this idea that older adults, part of a natural part of growing older is to disengage with society. That this is what older adults wanted to do. They had some kind of developmental imperative to disengage. Yes?
It's interesting what you're talking about. This is no abstraction for me since I'm 68 years old. So I'm trying to take this all in a good way, very personally. So the models for me, because I'm still working, the models for me about retirement are people who say things like, I'm so busy doing things that are important, getting involved in helping, volunteering, educating myself, getting involved in a variety of activities, and still making a contribution, that now that I look back, I don't know when I ever had time to work.
Yeah, and I've heard that too, right? And I, oftentimes when I wake up and I'm tired and I think, I've got a job to do, I'd love to be in that position. And I think, and I'm glad that this feels personal, actually, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think this is personal for all of us, right? We do have a tendency, gerontologists included, to think about old people as other. And I don't say that we mean to do that in any kind of mean way, but we tend to think about old people as not us. Old people are the people that we're served. If we're gerontologists, old people, those are our people. Those are our clients. Those are the people we serve. That's not us. And a lot of the work that we've done at VCU Gerontology has been around trying to parse and navigate that, that sense that there is an other. Because we actually see that as really problematic. Because when we think about aging, please raise your hand in this room if you are not aging. Okay. But think about, we talk about the aging population, but we're not talking about us, right? When we talk about the aging population, we think we're talking about old people. Well, the aging population, this is us. This is us, right? If we're lucky, we're all going to live into old age. We will be the lucky ones. So this idea of retirement as this thing that old people want to do, and Social Security makes it possible for them to do, that's nice. That's good for some people. But that's actually become institutionalized as something that you're expected to do. I know in the United Kingdom, they actually brought in a law about 10 years ago that you had to retire at 70. My question would be, what if you're not done at 70? What if your profession, your job, your career is very meaningful to you at 70 or 80? So, and it might interest you to know, in local health systems, at least as of about a year ago, in the Centaura health system, I think their oldest nurse is in her late 80s. All right, let's look at some non-Western cultural constructions of age. We've looked at Western ones so far. But the reason why I wanted to bring these up is we've been doing some work on elderhood. We've been doing research on elderhood at VCU Gerontology. We've become very interested in this. Our doorway into elderhood was through our work on ageism. And our thinking was, if ageism is something that we want to eradicate from society, then what would replace it? What would be the better thing to have? And so we've been really thinking about elderhood as being that better state of affairs. And so we started looking in the literature. We looked in the published literature, searching on this term elderhood, to see what we would find in our own discipline, which is the study of age and aging. And we found very little in our own discipline, in fact. But we did find some work on elderhood, and guess where we found it? We found it in the anthropological literature. So we found that a fair amount, not huge, but more than has been written in gerontology, has been written about elderhood with regard to indigenous peoples, meaning peoples who live in places that they were there already, and then Western civilizations came in and colonized, right? So we're talking about peoples who've experienced that. And what we learned in this literature was really fascinating. Really, well, first of all, it fascinates us that anthropologists will look at other cultures, right? But American anthropologists are not looking at American culture, right? Strange. But we saw a wide variation of what elders are in this literature. And teachers, it's not surprising, I think, right? For people who have a lot of lived experience, to see being a teacher and a mentor as being roles that are very prominent in some societies for elders. Being life guides, this is a really interesting one. Particularly in Native American culture, often elders in a tribe are seen as those who hold the responsibility for identifying the unique gifts of younger people in the tribe, and then helping to guide them towards the use and application of those gifts. It's another form of mentorship, really, isn't it? How about judges and resolvers of disputes and peacemakers? There are a number of societies that have been studied where elders definitely hold this role very prominently. And the thought is that they make really good peacemakers and judges and dispute resolvers because they've developed integrative thought, because they've developed this ability to see multiple perspectives, right? And then to be able to withhold judgment and help people come to an accommodation or an agreement. And last I looked in our world, we're in sore need. We're in sore need of that kind of skill. They've been seen as rainmakers. There are cultures in which elders are considered very powerful, powerful enough to control the weather, not in some kind of, I know there's, I've heard stories about, how the government controls the weather or whatever, but we're talking about through spiritual connections, right? Being able to make rain come so food will grow. They also, in many cultures, have a very interesting role as ancestral intercessors, or as those who can contact ancestral spirits. So we think about whatever our beliefs are, and our beliefs may well vary about what we think happens after our life here is completed. But there are societies in which elders are seen as the ones who have this spiritual connection with ancestors, that they can summon ancestors and the wisdom of ancestors and are connected with them. There are also societies in which older people are seen as tremendously powerful in terms of being able to use witchcraft. And using this witchcraft both to do good things and to put curses on people. And in all of the societies that we've looked at so far who've talked about elderhood, there's a very clear common thread running through this, and that is that it's not enough to be old for you to be considered an elder. It's not about your chronological age. Because, and think about this, let's think about our own experience of this for a moment, because in many ways, we're experts. If aging is about us, and we're experts in us, we're experts, right? Have you ever met an old fool? Have you ever met an old person who seemed immature? Yes, I have. I have met young people who are very mature, and I have met old people who are immature. So we can't say that all old people are wise, or all old people are mature, or all old people are going to make great peacemakers, because we know that's not the case. So age is necessary in the sense that what age does for us, what the passing of chronological time does for us, is provide us with an opportunity to live and to have experiences and to repeat experiences and hopefully to learn from experiences. No doubt we've all met, known, or loved people who haven't learned very much from their experiences. And we've met others who have. So age is necessary in the sense that it gives us the time to amass the lived experience. But it's an insufficient condition for elderhood because it's what we do with those experiences. It's the alchemy that we perform when we are able to transform our lived experience into wisdom that equates with elderhood. And in this literature on non-Western societies, we also found some really heartening concepts of aging. And there's one in particular from Botswana that I really love, and it's a concept called botsofe, which means that as our bodies weaken, our spirits strengthen, and that these things go hand in hand. They're going to happen together, and they're necessary together. And if you think about that, that's pretty different from how we see things in the West in general. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So why talk about elderhood now? Why should this be of interest to us? Well, we know that America's aging. And we know globally, many societies are aging. Western developed societies particularly, but almost all societies. And so we know by 2030, 1 in 5 people are going to be over the age of 65. 1 in 8 are going to be 75 or older by 2040. And so you see a big increase in the population 50 plus from 109 million to 132 million over the next 20 years. So what does this mean? What this means is we're living longer. That's a really good thing. And there's more of us. So we have opportunity here. We can choose to see this as a crisis, which I don't, and I think that's more than a choice. I think it's a reframing of our understanding about what we have here. If we believe at any level that the accumulation of lived experience is a gift in terms of providing us with the raw material to generate wisdom, then we have a tremendous opportunity here. We are in a most fortunate position. And it's curious to me that we don't see it that way. So what I want to do is ask you, I want you not to censor yourselves. And I want to just hear, if you're just willing to call out people who are comfortable doing that, give me the top 3 words that come to your mind when you think of aging. Or just give me one. I mean, let's just hear from you. Don't censor. Just when I say aging, what comes out?
Health.
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 Wisdom.
Opportunity.
Opportunity.
Bills.
Elders. Elders.
Strength.
Strength.
Grandkids.
Grandkids.
Volunteers.
Volunteer. Independence.
Endangered.
Endangered. What else? Don't be shy. What comes to your mind when you think aging?
Surgeries.
Surgeries.
Dying.
Dying.
Grandkids.
Grandkids.
Old.
Old.
Impact. Impact.
Impact.
The unknown.
The unknown.
Underrepresented.
Underrepresented.
And long-term care.
Long-term care, right. Do we know what percentage of the population live in long-term care who are over the age of 65? Give me a guess. Any guess? It's okay.
22%.
22%? 3%? Come on. You're shy this morning. Come on. It's okay. 5%. Usually when we ask brand new gerontology master students this question, we'll get 30, 40%. It's actually a really small percentage. So what I heard in the words that you were thinking was a wide variety, right? It wasn't one thing. Some of it was about social connections. Some of it was about spirituality and mystery, you know, the unknown, dying. We don't know what's going to happen. Some of it was very practical, things like bills and surgeries. That sounded biological too, like, you know, about our bodies. It's about our bodies, the way we socially move through the world, the way we think. The messages our society give us, what would you say the top 3 messages from society are about growing older? Obsolete.
In the way.
Hmm?
In the way.
Can't hear.
In the way.
In the way. Okay, in the way. Dependent. Okay, all right. That you can so readily identify those things is interesting to me and not surprising, because I would say to you that is part of our cultural narrative about growing older. Yeah? That is part of the cultural story that we're told and that we tell ourselves about growing older. What I'd like to share with you is what we know from gerontology about growing older and what many elders also know about growing older. And what we know is that unlike what society in general tells us about growing older, which is that it is a single story of our biological decline, then in fact it's very intricate, that we are very intricate beings. We are embodied beings, no doubt, meaning we have bodies and we make our way through the world in our bodies. So we have this physicality, and that physicality changes, yes? When you look at pictures of, you know, babies, and think of the life stages, babies and children, and think how fast babies change. When you haven't seen a baby for a couple of weeks, how fast the baby has changed and is developing. So we know that our bodies change throughout our lives. We have our psychology. This is multi-part, our psychology. Part of it is cognition, what we think and how that process of thinking occurs. Part of it is our emotionality, our affective states. We have a social presence. We know that human beings are very social animals. We are animals. I often think it's really helpful to think of ourselves as animals. It helps to explain a lot. We're very social. We crave affiliation. We die without affiliation with each other. Now, we all like different amounts of affiliation, some more, some less, but we know the research on social isolation shows that for people who have less social contact than they would like, hear that, because we don't all want the same amount of social contact, but for old people who have less social contact than they would like, it is the same as it's the same as giving them a pack of cigarettes to smoke a day, because it'll cut off 7.5 years of their life. So social isolation is dangerous, but it's determined by the individual, right? How much social contact they want. And we have a spiritual self, and I don't mean a religious self. Religion can be a way that we practice spirituality, and religion can be a lot more too. Religion can also be very social as a structure, and a very supportive social structure, and sometimes a punitive structure too. But I'm talking about spirituality, something different, something more, our concept of who we are in this universe, who we see as a higher power, if we even conceive it that way, how we understand our connectedness to everything else that is. So we have this spiritual self. We are all these things, these overlapping dimensions. We are very, very complex. The story that we hear, though, is often very much about our biology. With regard to growing older, it's the 3 Ds. It's that disease, decline, and death. And wrongly, but for sure this happens, societally, we have conflated being old with being sick. We assume that to be old is to be sick. And my PhD research was on ageism among healthcare professionals. And that's what I came here last year to talk about. We're very, very focused on this. Our society has really got us thinking about this. I guarantee you, when you drive wherever you're going from here today, particularly if you drive down a highway, I can pretty much guarantee you'll see at least one billboard shaming you for looking older, encouraging you to fight your aging or to defy the way your body is changing. And I'd encourage you to start thinking about why that's problematic. Why should we be shamed for something that's beautiful and natural and makes us the lucky ones? We also know that as human beings, our development is both dynamic, meaning it's full of movement, and it's multi-directional. So we grow, we experience loss, we adapt, and we maintain. We do this all throughout our lives. What's really interesting to me is that what we've done with aging is focus on the bottom part of this diagram, the loss, the adaptation, and the maintenance. We don't think of old age as a time of growth. In general, we don't. And I think that's I'm searching for the right word. It's misconceived. It's actually not our fault, because we've been absorbing ageism for as long as we've been around, for as long as we've been aware, probably before we were even really aware. It's in all of us, really, because it's so deep in our society. So we think about loss. We think, well, of course, old age is about loss. People die and they leave us, right? We get sick, our bodies decline. What are you talking about, Jenny? Of course it's about loss. How could you argue otherwise? Well, there are losses. There are certainly losses. But let me ask you this. Did you experience losses, whatever age you are now, just think, have you experienced loss in a previous period of your life? Of course, right? I mean, some of us experience really traumatic losses, like the loss of somebody we really love. But there are also smaller losses along the way. Childhood isn't this picnic of development, right? There's a lot of loss in childhood too. Loss of innocence, transitioning to adolescence, loss of clarity, right? All kinds of things. But we think about loss as piling up in old age. So, some examples of loss. There are losses in older age, and we see them in the biological realm, and we see them in the psychological realm too. We lose muscle mass, for sure. We know our skin loses elasticity. That's what wrinkles are all about. Our skin is changing. Fluid intelligence, which is part of our cognition, also has been shown in many, many studies to slow down. So fluid intelligence is our ability to solve logic and math problems quickly. And we have incontrovertible evidence that as we grow older, that ability slows down. It's been tested in labs many times. We know this. What's really fascinating is that it's usually not apparent out in the world in a naturalistic setting because we compensate for it. And we compensate for it with something called cognitive reserve, which is over here in the adaptation. We adapt. And so there's been lots of brain studies. One of the really cool things about living in the modern world is all the technology we've developed that can show us how things are. And so now you can scan brains and you can see what's occurring in a brain when somebody's doing something or thinking about something. And so we know from many studies of the brain that as areas of an older brain are affected by the aging process and become less, their processing speed and effectivity becomes less, that our brains create neural scaffolds. I'm not making this stuff up. This is from the science. Our brains create neural scaffolds that work around those damaged areas. And so this reduction in fluid intelligence, this reduced speed in solving logic and math problems is barely noticeable, if noticeable at all, because the brain is compensating. So our brains are very adaptive. We also adapt in terms of, if we think about ourselves effectively, emotionally, there's a theory called the multiple threshold theory. And this is an interesting theory. It talks about how we adapt to our own aging. And it says, when we hit a threshold that's meaningful to us, it pulls us up short, and we think about how are we going to work that into our self-identity now. So a good example might be hair going gray. Now, societally, well, gray hair seems to be maybe like it's coming into fashion a little bit recently. I was actually stopped by a student on the VCU campus a couple of months ago who said, well, I love your hair color. I wish my hair was that color. And I said, well, thanks, that's great. I said, it will be, just wait. But gray hair would be a good one, because particularly women have learned that it's not cool. We should want to cover that up, right? And so say we start to see gray hair, and that is a threshold that triggers us. We're like, oh, I'm getting old, my hair's gray. Or maybe for us, it's wrinkles, right? Whatever it is for us, we experience this threshold, and then we have a choice to make of how we work that into our identity. And it is really interesting how we see our own aging identity. I once worked with a very, very lovely woman. She was in her late 80s, and when she turned 90, she suffered a really severe depression. And when I was speaking with her daughter about it, this was in a senior living, in a senior retirement community that I worked in, her daughter said, all the time growing up, I remember my mom always making fun of what she called little old ladies. And she always said to me, when I'm 90, then I'll be a little old lady. Then it'll be me. And so for her, this was like this trigger. She had created this threshold for herself. She had turned 90. Nothing was different about her life. She was enjoying life. But man, did she really suffer, right, because of that threshold. We also know our systems maintain themselves with something called homeostasis, which is a Latin term, which is basically about the fact that our bodies stay in balance. A healthy body stays in balance. And that pretty much, in terms of its vital processes, and that pretty much occurs right until close to the end of life. But psychologically, we experience homeostasis as well. When we're psychologically well, our mind is in balance. In the literature on aging, in the published literature, which is where I spend a lot of my time, almost all of what's written is in that bottom part. And what's really interesting is even gerontologists take this view that it's about adapting to aging. Just think about that for a moment. Let's just, yes.
Just backing up just a second, when you were talking about the little old lady, the
Yeah.
90-year-old, it made me think of my cousin and I, who decided when we leave this place, we're going out as fly as we possibly can. We will be little old ladies in our high heel shoes, and at 90, and it just occurred to me that in earlier times, 90 wouldn't have been the number, but the fact that that's our threshold.
Yeah.
Really being old is 90 now.
Right, that's cool, isn't it? That's really cool. That's right, because there would have been a time, and not that long ago, where people did not live to 90. That would have been really unusual. Even turn of the 20th century, people were only living into their 40s. And there's some things that have helped longevity, like the introduction of penicillin, childbirth becoming more safe. There's been some things that we've been able to do that have made it possible for us to live longer. It's also interesting, they say, I've heard it said that this current generation is actually at risk of living less long than their parents because of lifestyle choices. It's framed as lifestyle choices, but it's a diatribe I won't go into, but I mean, I have a real issue with, you know, the whole thing about lifestyle choices. When you go to the grocery store and you're bombarded with food that isn't really food and things that aren't really healthy for you and they're all really cheap. I think that's more than about lifestyle choice, but I think our environment is our environment has the possibility, the opportunity to support our healthy aging or to damage it. And I actually see our environment being not very supportive most of the time. So what we don't spend a lot of time talking about is the growth, is seeing old age as a time of continued growth. And yet we know that it is. We have evidence for this. We have scientific evidence for this. There's another part of our cognition called our crystallized intelligence. So we had our fluid intelligence. We've established this is going down as we grow older. Our crystallized intelligence is increasing. It doesn't even peak until we're in our late 60s, early 70s. And maybe, to your point here, maybe that will keep moving further out, right, if we live longer and longer. So what's crystallized intelligence? Well, this is made up of a number of things, but think about your vocabulary. How much bigger is your vocabulary now than it was when you were 10 or 20 or whatever, right? And I'm still learning words. I don't know if anybody else reads like this, but I can't bear it if I come across a word and I don't know what it means, so I have to look it up. Now, what I have noticed is a lot of times I don't take it in right away, or I take it in and I lose it. That's one of the losses we experience, right? It's like a little harder to grab hold of and keep information. It's a little harder to get the information embedded. But once we do, we're good. So our crystallized intelligence, our vocabulary is larger, but it's more than that. Our capacity for integrative thought isn't really fully developed until around midlife. Our ability to see multiple points of view and hold those multiple points of view in our head, our ability to notice patterns in things, our ability to think strategically increases as we grow older. This is a definite gain. There's also a huge body of literature on wisdom and what is it. And there's all kinds of arguments about what it is. Nobody is settled on absolutely what wisdom is. But what all of that literature seems to show is that people who've had this opportunity to accumulate life experiences and who are reflective, who have some self-awareness, yes, enough self-awareness to sift through that experience and try and make sense of it, are then able to apply it. And so wisdom can come in some really interesting forms, like having a lot of knowledge and an ability to understand a situation, yet not constantly dispense advice to others. That actually would be wisdom, right? It's not about you've lived and you've amassed all this great stuff and now you're going to tell everybody how to live their lives. A big part of wisdom is actually letting people come to realizations themselves, right? Yes?
A long time ago, when I was younger, they would ask me everything, but now that I'm older, they don't ask me anything.
Oh, did everybody hear that? Okay, you didn't hear that. So say that one more time, a little louder.
When I was younger, they didn't ask me anything. And now that I'm older, when I was younger, they asked me everything. But now that I'm older, they don't ask me anything.
So when I was younger, they asked me everything. Now that I'm older, they don't ask me anything. And I have had older adults, when I've presented on elderhood, I've had some older adults say to me, how do I get people to hear me? You know, I have something to say. Well, part of that is our whole societal problem that we've marginalized older adults as being people that you don't have something to say, or they're people we need to take care of. But part of that is an understanding that actually listening to others is a very powerful form of mentoring, right? hearing other people. And you in the behavioral health profession, I guess, know this better than anybody, right? I mean, anyone who's ever had therapy and a good experience of therapy hopefully has experienced that phenomenon where you did most of the talking, right? And the behavioral health professional didn't talk a lot. You talked a lot and they didn't talk a lot, but maybe there was a little guiding, right? Hopefully there was guiding. All right, so despite the fact that the cultural story is about disease, decline, and death, actually it's about growth, maintenance, adaptation, and loss. And actually that's at every life stage, not just old age. So how we can think of ourselves is like we're a map. We're a map of our own journey. Very unique, each different, imprinted on by what we have experienced. And something really interesting about developmental stages is that when we are babies and children, we are more like each other, right? When we start out, we're more like each other. And don't we know this from our experience? Anyone who's known a baby or had a baby or cares for babies knows that when babies don't do certain things by a certain time, people get worried. The baby's not talking. The baby's not sitting up. The baby's not walking, right? We have these developmental milestones. And yes, they have some wiggle room in them. But they work, by and large, because at that end of our life journey, we are more alike. We are more like each other. Although anyone who's ever known a baby well, more than one baby, will know that they're not all the same, right? I'll never forget having a boy, and then having another boy and thinking, I've got this, because I just had a boy. Boy, I did not have it. Those two boys were so different. But as we grow through our life's journey, as we journey, we become more different because we're becoming more like ourselves. And so, whereas culturally, we see older adults as a block, and we talk about them as a block. We even call them the elderly. Like they're all the same. Like they're a they. Like they're not us. It's interesting. Actually, older adults are more unlike each other than children. They're more like themselves. There's more difference. There's more heterogeneity the older people get. Very dangerous territory to think that we understand older adults or older adulthood. Not possible. The other interesting thing is that I like to think of it like this, that we age in a convoy of ourselves. Anybody familiar with the concept of possible selves? I see some heads nodding. I really love that concept. The idea of possible selves is that our self, our identity, at any one time is actually a collection of identities, not just one. It is a collection of who we are now, who we have been in the past, who we may become in the future, selves that we admire, selves that we fear, all kinds of selves. When I think about growing older, and I think about growing older in convoy with myself, here's what I think about. You may have said this, you may have heard people say this. I still feel like I'm whatever age inside. So I'm 55 right now, today. And so if I were to say, I feel like I'm 25 inside, right? This is not an uncommon experience for people to feel that or think that or say that. I want you to just pause a minute and think about that. So what I would say to you is, here's 55-year-old me. And 55-year-old me is in convoy with all the other me's who've ever been. 25-year-old me is in there. 15-year-old me is in there. 3-year-old me is there. 40-year-old me is there. They're all in there. They're all in there with me, right? But if I'm to say, well, I feel like I'm 25. Okay. I remember 25-year-old me, and I don't want to be her again. Okay? That was hard. But there's some hard things about being 55, and there were some fun things about being 25-year-old me. But my point is, if I were to say, I haven't changed, I feel just the same as I did when I was 25, Actually, what I think we're saying is, I remember being 25, and we have a tendency to put the rose-colored specs on and look back and see that 25 was all wonderful. When we really think about it, 25 was a mix like every other age. But if I'm to say, I still feel like I'm 25. The only problem is outside I look 55. Inside I feel 25. Actually, I'd be really sad if that were true, because I would have just taken away 30 years of lived experience, 30 years of hard-won insight that I did not have when I was 25. I think there were things that I did know at 25, but I didn't fully understand them. And there were some things I didn't see at all that I see now. And I'm really excited because I think 75 and 85 and 95-year-old me will have even deeper insights. So we can think of ourselves at any point in time as being all of the ages we have ever been. We are children and young people and who we are now. So my question is, what if we were to look at growing old differently? And you may recognize this. This is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, 1943. It gets used in all kinds of ways because it's just so useful. So Maslow's hierarchy talked about this series of needs that we couldn't satisfy needs higher up this pyramid unless we had satisfied the needs below it at the base. So people with no shelter are not going to be worrying about self-actualization and the full development of themselves because they need shelter. And that's where the focus of their energy is going to go. What I would say to you, what I see in society is that we have focused our attention on older people at the bottom of this pyramid. We want to keep them safe. We see them as being perhaps not having good judgment, perhaps needing our protection, vulnerable. We're here to serve them. We want to help them. We want to meet these needs. And we have not paid as much attention to other needs. I think there is a growing awareness about social isolation, and so there's growing awareness of needing to work at the level of belonging in this hierarchy. I don't know so much about esteem and self-actualization, though. I actually think when I look at the balance of where our work is with older adults, not a lot of it is there. We're too busy toiling at the bottom of this pyramid trying to take care of old people. When in fact, my sense is that, like everybody else, these same needs that Maslow identified are still in operation for all of us at all ages. So I think we've got about 5 minutes to the break. Maybe this would be a good time to break. Okay, let's break here then. We're going to break for 10 minutes, so we'll come back at 10:05 if that works for you, and we'll continue. All right, let's carry on. Yes.
I want to make a very brief observation if you go back one slide.
Yes, absolutely.
Just as we age or get older, you also begin to work back down, because now I think about safety needs, I think about false risks, and I plan ahead for when I am in 10, 20 years older, where am I going to be physically so I'm going to be cared for. So even though I think about the other things, I also begin to work back down to make sure I'm caring for myself and keeping myself mobile and safe.
I love that point. That you have actually just, that wasn't planned, but you have provided me with a beautiful segue to read something, if that's okay. So, because I absolutely agree with you. Does anybody know who Ram Dass is? Yes, okay, some of you. He's a spiritual leader. Let me just read a short passage that he wrote called Getting Hip. I think it really speaks to your point. Last year, and this was when he was an older man, last year I had an accident. I fell on my hip. There it was, a broken hip. I am 80 years old now, so I guess it comes with the territory. But that broken hip was my own fault. I'm in a wheelchair much of the time, and that day I was transferring from an armchair to the wheelchair. I did not focus carefully. That is, I did not bring my full awareness to bear on what I was doing, so I fell. This is a dilemma for me. If I pay attention to my body full time, even when I am transferring, then my consciousness does not get to be with my soul because I am attending to my body as most people do. So I'm in the hospital getting my hip repaired. Hospitals are body-orientated. It is the body shop. To most of the hospital staff, I'm the old guy in room 322 with a broken hip. That is who I am in their minds. They are the nurses and doctors. They're the professionals, and they must know, right? But don't we also have a spiritual identity? Aren't we also souls? The overwhelming mindset of the hospital is no, we are not souls, we're just bodies. Now, my view is that I'm in this incarnation to learn about my true self, to learn about my soul. Along the way, I've also learned a lot about strokes and broken hips. I found you can think about them in many different ways. These bodies really capture our attention. As our parents impressed upon us, you better watch out or you're going to hurt yourself if you do not attend to your body. But from another point of view, the workings of the body are grist for the mill to get to the soul. And it is tough work. If you think learning to swim is hard, it ain't nothing compared to this. The body is out there, and the soul, the I, is in here. To get into my soul, I must turn my attention inward instead of outward. But I have to turn it selectively inward, because at the same time the body is demanding attention, and I better decide where my foot should go. Otherwise, I'm going to get myself killed. So I attend to my body when it's time, and the rest of the time I work on being a soul. A good analogy for body and soul is a coach with horses and a coachman, and a rider inside the coach. The horses are desires. The coachman is the ego, the I that controls the desires and looks where he is going and makes sure the foot does not go in the wrong place. But who is the passenger riding in the coach? It's our soul. Coachman, would you stop, please? Coachman, you're going a little too fast. I am riding in my coach, and now and then my coach needs a grease job or a new bearing or a joint replaced. I was just at a coach shop for a hip joint, and they know everything about coaches. But that is not who I am, because I am inside the coach, riding along, merrily, merrily, merrily. On the outside, I'm recovering from a hip replacement operation, but inside, I am dancing. I look like an old fart, but I'm dancing inside. And what a joyful, joyful dance. In India, it is called the Leela, the dance or the play of the soul. And you can join in any time, because it's always going on in here, in this moment, and it never stops. Did I lose my soul in the hospital? Well, maybe I lost my connection with my soul for a while, but I did not lose my soul. Where could it go? I'm still here. I have a new hip. I'm even hipper than I was. And I love that, right? Because I think that his understanding of being older was really nuanced. And what I'm not saying, and I'm so glad you raised this, what I'm not saying is, let's pretend there isn't decline. Let's pretend that everything's easy. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying let's engage with the fact that it's all of those things, all bundled together. Yes?
Is there a way to access that reading on the internet? Or did that come out of a book?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I would probably Google Ram Dass. He's written a lot of really interesting things. Yeah. But I could probably, I'm going to send the slide deck to Eric, and I could also excerpt that and send that if you'd like that. Okay. Okay.
One of my thoughts is when you were reading that, and actually back before, most all doctors were holistic before the AMA from some of the reading I've done. But the point is, I think, is that I'm hearing more and more and reading more and more about holistic healing.
Yes.
And that the thought of us as seniors or elders or whatever you want to call us nowadays, that the issue of that is becoming more and more, and there's more there's more things to read up about it, and there's more people, and there's local, actually, holistic doctors.
I'm so encouraged to hear that. Yes, because we are one vessel. Our minds and our bodies are in this together, right? One isn't there without the other. And I think part of the challenge is in a lot of medical training is very biomedically focused. That's even the case now for nurses. I'll come to you in just one sec. And so the training being very biomedical in focus, it isn't that healthcare professionals don't like old people or don't want to do well for old people, but it's that the training is encouraging them to focus on cure. And the reality of being older is that we're going to be talking about a lot of care, because we're going to be talking eventually about chronic conditions that are not going to go, that we will die with, right? And so we will not surmount these through pieces of technology or equipment or pills, right? That this will be part of our process is going to be a physical decline resulting in a physical death. Not going to argue otherwise. So I'm encouraged to hear that there are more doctors seeing it in that bigger picture. And we had somebody here too. Yes?
Yeah. Do you agree that with all indigenous cultures, wherever they come from, that with holistic medicine and healing and treatment, that regardless of the age, that these indigenous cultures continue a circle of giving back? So in fact, ageism or the elderly are giving back to the earth to replenish it and help it as it teaches our young to grow and, as you said, recoup resources, whether it's in dance or culture through like native jewelry, beadwork, or in other indigenous cultures teaching how to birth, rites of passage, and growth and journey. Journey is circular, it's not linear, with an implication of death.
Oh, I have chills listening to you speak. Yes, I mean 100% yes. And I think that, that some of that's going to come up now in a couple of the theorists that I want to show you. But I'm so with you and so hopeful that we'll see an increasing understanding of those roles for elders that you've just so beautifully outlined. So we won't tarry here too long, but do we have any Jungian people in here? I'm not a clinician, but I really love the writings of Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who was very interested in the second half of life, which he characterized as the afternoon of life. You can see here a quote from him saying, "The afternoon of life is just as full of meaning as the morning, only its meaning and purpose are different." And what Jung was saying was that it's futile and a wasted opportunity to live the second half of our life the way we lived the first half, because the second half has a different purpose. The second half, he believed, his view was that our goal was actually our individuation, that this was our developmental imperative across our lives to become who we are, to grow into ourselves. And that to do that, we required some inner reflection time, that this would not be possible to do if we pursue this busy ethic. And one of the really interesting things I think about long-term care, because I'm a licensed assisted living administrator. I'm not currently practicing because I'm teaching, but I think about when I was practicing, and long-term care definitely operates on the activity theory and this busy ethic, that we've got to keep people busy. We've got to keep them engaged. We know social engagement is very protective, but we've got to keep people busy, busy, busy. But if we're too busy, what happens? You know, we suffer from hurry sickness. I often feel like I suffer from this. I want to slow down. I want more reflection time. I do not want to feel like I'm being chased through my life by, cell phones snapping at my heels and, emails. I mean, anyway, that's another story. That's me. So we have so that was Jung. We also have Tornstam. Lars Tornstam was a Swedish sociologist, also now passed on, who developed a theory called gerotranscendence. And his view was that as we grow older, we become more transcendent, meaning we grow beyond our own ego. get this ability to see ourselves in a different way, to understand ourselves as connected to everybody else, to generations that came before us, to generations that will come after us. So to this point that we just heard, developing this interest in nurturing generations that are to come, caring for the earth, protecting resources, right? Protecting what we see as very valuable. He also noticed that older adults socialized differently, and there's been a lot of psychological studies about this too. So we know in the social dimension of being an older adult that there are some things that tend to happen. Our social circles tend to constrict. They tend to become smaller. What's very interesting is this is not because nobody likes old people and because old people are stubborn and difficult and nobody wants to be with them and because they want to be on their own. It's very deliberate. That's what's been shown in the research. There's a very deliberate tightening, a pruning, if you like, of social networks. Pruning out people who are not good for me. Pruning out people who I do not want in my life because they're not good for my soul, right? And keeping close to me those people who I really treasure. And we see this over and over again in studies of the social lives of older adults. And I've kind of mentioned this cosmic dimension. Tornstam was very influenced by Eastern theory. And Jung was to a certain extent too. Jung's mother, I don't know if you know a lot about him, fascinating the way he grew up. His mother believed in the occult. They would have seances when he was growing up, but because Jung believed in a collective unconscious, that we all tap into this collective unconscious. And Tornstam also believed that older people transcended their own understanding of themselves and understood themselves as cosmic beings, beings that could actually travel through space and time. And I know that sounds a little wacky. He didn't mean they were going to literally fly through space and time. What he meant was inside, that people would travel across generations. What he also noticed in the many, many older people that he worked with was that these features were accompanied by an increase in life satisfaction. And we know from the research that despite what our culture says about aging being a bad thing and a hard thing and a sad thing, that actually there's a U-curve of happiness. And it tends to be, we're in the higher on the U when we're very young. In midlife, we're kind of, in that kind of dip of the U. And then in older life, people's life satisfaction often goes up. And also fear of death often goes down.
Just an observation.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about how to articulate this best, and I'm curious if other people in this room are experiencing it. So as you've been talking, I've been having to challenge my own, I don't think stereotype is the right word, but my own conceptions about aging, because I think all of us deal with a sample bias if we're working in mental health, or in my case, neuropsychology, where I'm dealing primarily with neurodegenerative disorders. So it's that sample bias where we're seeing people that may be less reflective of this data, which has a much more diverse sample.
So I love this point that you're raising, and I recognize it, and I respect it, because the reality is many healthcare professionals are serving a homogeneous subset of a very heterogeneous population. That's the first point. And the second point is that, and I should have clarified this earlier, so I'm grateful for this opportunity to do so. Here we're talking about normal aging. We're talking about not pathology, not disease, right? So if I am living with dementia, my opportunities to experience some of this will be constrained, right? That's just a reality. Although we could have, and it'll be a conversation for another day, really about our conceptions about what it is to live with dementia, because I think we have a lot of stereotypes around that too. Because we have a cognitive bias in our society, that our bias in society is towards cognitive mastery and towards independence, right? And so when people fail to achieve those hallmarks of what it is to be an adult, then they become other. But that is I'll come back next year and we'll talk about that one maybe, if you want to. Okay, but thank you. Those are great points. And yes, we all have biases, it's true. So Erikson, you're probably very familiar with his stage theory of development. Yes, this is, more grist for your bill as behavioral health professionals. So Erikson he had identified 8 life stages, 6 of which were prior to later life. So he was very interested in child development. However, he did have some really interesting observations about older age. And he conceived this along an infinity loop, which is not surprising. And if you think about it, I don't know if you're seeing it, but I'm seeing the pattern from Jung to Tornstam through Erikson as well of this idea of infinity, of this connection across these temporal boundaries. And he believed, as you probably well know, that we had developmental challenges at each life stage, and we needed to go through these challenges and resolve these challenges. And in the 2 life stages that he identified in old age, he felt that in the penultimate one, our challenge was to figure out how we would remain involved so that we could avoid resignation or detachment or disengagement. How do we continue to remain involved? And a question to think about is, how do older adults continue to remain involved in a society that marginalizes them, that pushes them to the margins, that doesn't expect them to want to remain involved? Let's think back about retirement. If the expectation culturally is that we will retire and get out of the way and go play and whatever it is we do, what does involvement look like? What does that look like? And then his ultimate stage was at the end of life, close to the end of life, that he believed that our developmental challenge was to make ourselves right with ourselves, to find closure, to make sure that our ego integrity was intact, and that failure to achieve that developmental challenge would lead to our sense of despair, to a sense of depression. And what's really interesting about later life is that depression is widely underdiagnosed in older adults, which is tragic because we know that it's very treatable. We know that it responds very, very well to treatment in older adults like people at any other age, and yet is seriously underdiagnosed. Why? Well, there are probably many reasons, but one of them likely is that there is an expectation that to be old is to be depressed. What do you expect? Of course you're going to be sad and depressed that you're old, right? Because we're not supposed to want to be old. The other interesting thing about Erikson is you'll notice, no doubt, how childhood and old age line up on that infinity loop. And Erikson believed that old age and childhood had a lot of similarity, but not in the way that a lot of us think about it. A lot of us, consciously or unconsciously, may think of older adults and young children as being very similar, not fully capable, needing our protection and support, needing our guidance, needing our help, not fully independent, dependent on us. That is not where Erikson was coming from. Erikson felt that there were real similarities in these developmental stages in terms of this idea of becoming who we are. And so to this point that, was it you or I don't remember who said about time not being linear, but it's a loop, right? That was you, yes. And I love that point because I think that's what he's saying here, that we've made it seem like, and in my diagrams I made it seem like it's a linear progression, right? In fact, that's not what Jung, Tornstam, or Erikson see at all. They see what you see. They see this infinite loop. Okay, Bill Thomas is a geriatrician, so he's a doctor specializing in the treatment of older adults. And he is the founder of the greenhouse movement, which is a way of providing long-term care, specifically skilled nursing care to older adults that is very home-like, that is non-institutional in nature. And I think he was digging into the anthropology literature when he came up with these, because that's certainly what I've seen in the anthropology literature, that elders have specific and very important roles in society of making peace within their own families to begin with. Anyone who's lived in a family knows that family's not always peaceful, right? Some of you probably work with families, Yeah, can be really challenging, right? So making peace within our own families, and then making peace in our communities, and making peace in our world, something we're sorely, sorely in need of. Wisdom giving, which we've talked about, but also legacy creation, which is this interest in things that will go on beyond me being here physically. What investments can I make in society, in community, in the environment, or in children and young people, in organizations and structures that will endure beyond me? And he really believed that old age was a developmental stage, not something to be fought, not something to be mitigated, but something to engage in actively. And then we have Gene Cohen's human potential stages. Gene Cohen was a psychiatrist, the first head of the Mental Health and Aging Federal Research Program. He's passed on now too, unfortunately. And he was very interested in mid to late life. He didn't want to even talk about development in earlier life. He figured that had been really covered. He talked about midlife onward, and he saw these phases, and he saw them as being overlapping. It wasn't like because you can see the age ranges are overlapping. It wasn't like you passed through one and then you were in the next one, which is kind of how Erickson looked at it. But he felt like from around our 30s to maybe our 60s, that we were engaged in this midlife reevaluation. Some people have cast this as the midlife crisis. I don't personally like the crisis language. I think, again, it's problematization of something that's actually a developmental imperative. But what he saw was people reassessing and really kind of wanting to know more. And he gives an example of how we do this using what he calls quest energy. And his example was of Alex Haley, who spent 12 years researching his family history, which culminated in the publication of Roots, which many of you have seen. I hope all of you have seen. And that was published when he was 55. So it's this use of this quest energy, not a crisis, not a who am I existential crisis, but this feeling that there's more to do. There's deeper things to dig into here. And then this liberation phase, which often co-occurs with retirement. And we can think about that again in terms of social construction. Some of us can afford to be liberated from work by retirement, and some of us cannot, right? So that may depend on, our socioeconomic status, but he saw this certainly for people who were able to have time freed up. That was to your point earlier. How could I ever have done a job? I'm too busy, right? And then we would go through this summing up phase of kind of looking back on our life, trying to make sense. Because if we do nothing else as human beings, we make meaning. That's what we do. We want to make meaning out of everything. And then this encore phase where we would pull all of our loose threads together at the end of life. So this is just a recap, really. That's what our culture says about growing older, that it's about, that aging is about sickness and decline, that to be old is bad, it's to be ugly, it's to be irrelevant, and it's to be a taker. And to be young is to be good, beautiful, relevant, and to be a provider. So in the break, somebody asked me, why are you saying the word old? You keep saying old people, and then sometimes you say older people. I deliberately say old people because we're afraid to say it. Because we feel like it's bad, because nobody wants to be an old person. In fact, in some of the research we've done, we've had older people say to us, I'm not old, I'm more mature. You can call me more mature. Well, but old is neutral, right? But the reality about old is too, what is it really? If you're buying into what I'm saying, that it's psycho, social, spiritual, and biological, then it's really hard to answer the question, what is old? And when is old, right? It's not like all of a sudden one day we're old. So I say older a lot too because age is relative. I am young to an 85-year-old. I'm old to my 19-year-old daughter, right? So it's relative. But if any of this makes you begin to think about your conceptions of age and aging, that's a really good thing. Because our society is telling us that if elderhood is anything, then it's weaker, worse, and wrinklier than adulthood. That we'll be adults, but just increasingly decrepit adults. Right? And what I'm saying is, I don't buy that. Let's reclaim elderhood as being its own developmental stage, right? It's different from adulthood. And the culture says, so, all right, you're going to get older, you can't hold it back, but if you can't be young, at least try and look young and act young. Yes?
Make a quick comment. As I shared with you during the break, a dear friend of mine passed very recently. And I was just thinking as you were talking that it's so common at funerals to have a picture, of course, of the deceased. But what I just realized was oftentimes those pictures are of a younger, more vital, so forth. My friend suffered from Parkinsonism. The picture that they chose was obviously taken within the last year of his life. And he looked like an 87-year-old who was suffering from Parkinsonism. But that was the last representation of this man that we all loved. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, here I am, here we are, here's how I remember him without apologies.
Yes. Yes. And I think thank you for sharing that. And I think that the messaging has been so relentless to us that it is ugly to look old, that we really have this horror of it. And that can be really, really deep inside us. And I think that just noticing that this is happening is a really, really good start. So what I really want to do, and we don't have too much time, but I think we have enough time, is maybe spend 5 minutes for you to reflect about how your elderhood is different from your adulthood. Now, looking around the room, I see people of different life stages in this room. So some people may feel like, I'm not anywhere close to anything that's like elderhood. So for you, I ask you, think forward. How would you like your elderhood to be different from your adulthood? So you can think about what your adulthood is like now. If you feel comfortable thinking about yourself as an elder now, then you can think about how your elderhood is different from your adulthood. What is it that you like and appreciate? Do you do things differently, and what are they? And if you have a piece of paper on your table, so maybe you just spend a couple of minutes just reflecting, and then no one needs to share who doesn't wish to share. But if anyone wishes to share, they may. That would be fine. Do we have anyone who might be comfortable sharing? Or are you more comfortable keeping your reflections to yourself? All right, we got somebody here.
Okay, on the first question, how is your elderhood different from your adulthood, how it will be? Well, I am transitioning because I'm 68, but I'm still working. So the first thing I wrote down is I'm transitioning to be a writer, and I am putting to relative rest some old demons, so which has to do with finding more serenity and peace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for sharing. So being in transition, yes.
Yeah, I have 4 daughters, and of course they're adults now. But what's happening here is just a great friendship with adult daughters instead of younger daughters when they were swimmers and all that kind of stuff. And especially then them letting me be friends to their grandkids as well. Although I'm kind of heavy on it. I have 4 daughters and 6 granddaughters. Wow. 1 grandson. I'm going to his ball game tomorrow. But that's been a gift, a real gift, as they've grown and then become adults, to have such a friendship with them.
Yeah, so the gift of friendship with grown children. Yeah, and with grandchildren, that's lovely. Thank you. Yes.
I did this before your talk.
Yes.
I see my priorities more clearly, and I have less tolerance for drama and chaos. So it's like social pruning. I just spend a lot of time with myself. I love to be alone. And I wanted to share with folks that, I don't know if y'all know, that you can take courses for free at the junior college if you're over 62.
That's great.
Yeah. So
that's great. And that is actually really protective. Remember when I was talking before about neural scaffolds in our brain? There's good scientific evidence to show that we can encourage that process by learning new skills. And so lifelong learning is very, very protective. Yeah.
And I'm studying French, and I attempted it in the mid-'80s, abysmal, and attempted it in the mid-'90s, And I mean, I'm blowing it out of the water at 66.
That's awesome. And learning languages
100%
is a
on
great
exams.
example. In fact, in terms of building cognitive reserve, learning languages or learning a new musical instrument are both said to be very, very protective. Ballroom dancing is too, by the way, because if you think about ballroom dancing, it requires the engagement of our bodies and our cognition because the steps can be complicated, but so you're socializing with people when you're doing it too. So as you know, you would be in school, presumably, you know, socializing with people too. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I think it's helpful to think about, you know, how elderhood might be different from adulthood for any of us. I think it's also interesting to think about what we may have lost. So I want to say this carefully. I want to say it right. A lot of times we'll look at what other societies have lost, losses to indigenous people that have occurred because of colonization and occupation of lands and attempts to eradicate language and culture. And we see these as losses, and they are grievous losses. One of the things I think we're not so accustomed to doing is turning that lens around on our culture and understanding that we have some losses here too. And one of these gaping holes is our connection to elderhood. Because in 21st century America and Western society in general, we've lost milestones for elderhood, assuming that these existed at some time. I'm going to assume at some time in some way they did. We don't have initiation ceremonies into elderhood, so we have somebody here who feels he's transitioning into his elderhood. We don't have a rite of passage or any kind of initiation process to guide people. So we know in many societies, adolescence, I framed it as a Western thing, but we know actually from studies of indigenous peoples that there are initiation rites around adolescence, helping young, mainly men, sometimes women, transition into adulthood, often guided by elders. Where are these initiation rites and rites of passage for us? And actually, when I've spoken about this before, I've had an older person say to me, who can mentor me? I'd like to be mentored in this journey, this transitional journey. But who is there to do that for me? Especially if all of the shouting around us from our culture is be young, look young, stay an adult as long as you can, right? If we're not even willing to embrace this life stage, then who will be there to mentor us into it and through it? And we also, that you saw that list of roles for elders, and we've talked a bit about the different kind of roles for elders. We have very constrained roles for elders societally right now. Societally, it's like retire and go play. Well, for some people, that's great. That's exactly what they want. But we know that it's a heterogeneous population, so only some people are going to want that. What about people who don't want that? What about people who want to remain engaged? The one place where we kind of seem like we're more okay with that is in politics. It seems to be a kind of thing where we're kind of more comfortable seeing older figures in that realm. But in the workplace ageism is alive-oh. Even though there's legislation to protect us against it, it doesn't work. How to overcome workplace ageism?
Well, I mean, I recently I worked for a government contract and I lost a job, I had for a long time because they cut out that classification. So a couple of months ago, I went over to a big, as you may know, a big mental health state facility here. So I walked over there for a job interview, and actually I looked pretty cool at that time. So I walked in there, and it's like their faces dropped, all these millennial, and I thought, you're screwed, Anita. I mean, it's over. And it was over. So I don't, even though you got this piece rolling inside you, that's capable and connected and everything, I don't see any way to get around it.
It's a tough one, and I think we need to educate people. We need to educate people. So, you're going to write them a letter? Well, and I think, here's the trouble with ageism. It's hiding in plain sight. because it's still acceptable. It's illegal, but still acceptable. And the reason why I say it's still acceptable is just go take a trip down the birthday card aisle of the grocery store. And I defy you to find more than a tiny handful of cards that aren't rude and ugly about growing older. They shame us for growing older. We would not do that to other groups of people. We would recognize that that's inappropriate. We don't shame people because they're women or men or one race or another race. Well, I don't think we've eradicated all of that from our society either, frankly. But I think there is at least some acknowledgement that that is inappropriate. There's no such acknowledgement for many people about age. It is a subject of fun and fear. And I'm sad to say, even in my own discipline of gerontology, there's not always a fully formed recognition because the bias is often unconscious. So one of the things we would say, one of the ways to deal with this, it's a long-term way, that's the trouble, it's not going to do a whole lot in the short term, is to educate people that this is not about old people, this is about us. So one day, the person who's a hiring manager who's discriminating will be discriminated against, one day. And to get people to see that this is about them, yes.
Your experience, I had two experiences. I'm 76 now, but I was 75 when this happened. And I've owned my own retail stores for 30 years and all that stuff. But see, Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, I was getting antsy. And I didn't want a full-time job, but by the same token, I wanted to I was missing retail. So Jamestown Yorktown Foundation needs a merchandising manager for the gift shops. So I'll tell you, to go online and do their application is a pain in the butt. It takes you about 3 hours to do. And I even knew the person that was retiring from that position. Plus I know the neighbor. My neighbor is the assistant director of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. So I applied for the job. And I was perfect. I could walk in and I could do the job without training almost, other than one thing, I didn't get the job. There was a merchandising job at Bush Gardens, just part merchandising and to run some gift shops. I applied for that job too, and I didn't get it. I would have been perfect for the job, but I've been told by 2 or 3 people my age, Golly, I'm 75. They want somebody who's going to be there for a while, I guess. But it's twice that.
Well, let's look at that. They want somebody who's going to be there for a while. All of the evidence shows that people don't stay in jobs long term, like they might have done several decades ago, right? That people cycle through employment, and so a lot of this is stereotype based, right? And so, what are the stereotypes of older adults? They're slow. They won't be able to handle technology. They're probably going to be crotchety. They probably won't want to be told what to do by a younger person. So these are all negative stereotypes that, frankly, hiring managers should be ashamed of themselves for employing. And one of the challenges, though, often our experience has been diversity training often doesn't include age as an aspect of diversity. Often. And we need to change that. We need to educate people. Yes?
Yeah. Back in the 70s, there was an organization called the Great Panthers, the women's first
Yes, Maggie Kuhn.
Thank you. And it seems to me that part of changing the national conversation, I think, is about educating people, but I think there also needs to be social action, social advocacy. Because, and look at the Me Too Time's Up movement, for example, that there's a tipping point where the national conversation shifts. So I think it has to be dealt with at that level, and I think we need to organize.
I like that. I'm on board with that. Yeah. I mean, I think that we can frame discrimination on the basis of age as an issue of social justice that is going to impact all of us. And if you think about it, has already impacted us because we can be ageist against young people too. Anytime somebody says, ugh, millennials, meaning, lazy, entitled, wada, 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 that's ageism. People aren't alike. Okay, so people can be alike from the same generation only in the sense that they have experienced the events in the world around them at roughly the same stage in their lives. That's it. That's where it stops, right? But we conflate those cohort effects with what it is to be a certain age, and we're wrong. My best example of that conflation is this. I was born in 1962. I didn't see a computer until not even the first time I entered the workforce. Some years into me being in the workforce was the first time I ever saw a computer, right? So I had to learn. My daughter, born in 1998, was using a mouse at the same time she was using a book. So when my daughter is a 90-year-old woman, she will be IT proficient in every way because she always has been. And I will probably always be slower because I learned it later. You know, I already knew a different way before. The different way worked okay for me. Frankly, and I've already told you before, I'd be happy if they shut email off. But anyway, but that's another story. But my point is we do conflate cohort with age. Yes?
I think a lot of times older people like me put that on themselves because I started IT in my late 20s. And I can blow anybody out of the water. I can sit in front of any software on the planet and just start using it.
There you go.
And I see people who, you know, I'm working with folks my age, and they're struggling 5 years later to attach a file to an email. And it's their mind. They have shut their mind to their capacity, which is infinite, to use a computer because it's a dialogue with the machine.
So, and I thank you so much for your point. Your point is great, and you're absolutely right. It's called age blaming, and it can be explained by this concept of stereotype threat. There have been lots of psychological studies done in labs of stereotype threat. If you prime somebody with a stereotype about themselves, then they will perform worse on a task. So if we prime people with stereotypically negative words about aging and then ask them to do a memory task, they'll perform worse. Even young people. So yeah, we do it to ourselves. All right, I gotta finish, it's 11. Okay, so here's the last piece that I wanna share with you. The American Psychological Association has a wonderful set of guidelines. Eric is gonna email the presentation out so you'll get the link. Guidelines for psychological practice with older adults. If you've not read these guidelines and you practice behavioral health and you have older clients, even if you don't, I would really love you to dig into these. The APA has done a wonderful job. It's right on the cutting edge of trying to eradicate ageism from your professions. And I'm just going to show you 3 of the APA guidelines. APA says we need to recognize how our attitudes and beliefs about aging and older individuals may be relevant to their assessment and treatment and seek consultation and further education about these. What we know from studies we've done at VCU Gerontology and other researchers have done is what we believe about our own aging matters to the way we treat older people. I just completed my doctorate. My doctoral research was on ageism among healthcare professionals. My research found, and it's a finding that is replicated in other studies, healthcare professionals with a more negative attitude about their own aging have more negative attitudes to older patients. It is about us. We have to look at ourselves. Guideline number 4 from the APA, strive to be aware of the social and psychological dynamics of the aging process, especially lifespan development. That's all the stuff we've talked about today. So we don't want to hover around the bottom end of Maslow's hierarchy, right? We want to understand that later life is also a developmental stage that also involves self-esteem and self-actualization, not just maintenance and adaptation. And guideline number 5 is to understand that this is a heterogeneous population and that we have all of these socio-cultural factors that impact how we grow older. Our gender, race, our ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, our sexual orientation, our disability status, whether we're urban, whether we're rural, these all could potentially influence our experience. So aging is highly individual. So here's the takeaway. It starts with self. It starts with us. And this is Lucille Clifton, whose poem I so love. I am not done yet. As possible as yeast, as imminent as bread, a collection of safe habits, a collection of cares, less certain than I seem. more certain than I was. A changed changer. I continue to continue. What I have been most of my lives is where I'm going. So thank you for listening today. I really appreciate it. I was happy to be here with you today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your life.